It was the moment no one ever truly believed would happen. A single envelope, quietly tucked away for decades, has just shattered the silence inside one of the most guarded places in the world. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single update as this story unfolds. What we are witnessing right now is not just a family revelation, but a seismic shift that could redefine everything the monarchy has stood for. A private document, handwritten and sealed in 1996, has emerged at last, and its contents are sending shockwaves through every corner of the palace. This is about the uncovering of a secret will, a collection of personal directives that appear to hold power over tradition itself. At the center of it all is one extraordinary woman, her carefully chosen words, and a plan that was never meant to stay buried forever. The will was not found during a dramatic raid or a loud announcement. It surfaced during something as ordinary as an archival review deep within Windsor's restricted chambers. Shelves of leather-bound boxes and time-worn ledgers line these corridors, and tucked among them was an envelope marked only with a simple phrase, "Private, to be opened at the right time." That right time, it seems, has finally arrived. The discovery stunned the archivists who first came across it. For years, rumors had whispered of a hidden document, written in a steady, familiar hand. But no one ever confirmed it. Now, with palace lawyers and trusted witnesses verifying its authenticity, those whispers have turned into a storm of speculation. Inside the envelope lay a will unlike anything expected. It was handwritten, carefully dated, and legally witnessed in 1996. Every line carries the weight of someone who knew exactly what she wanted to say. There were personal statements, gentle reflections, but also clear instructions. It was as if she had looked far into the future, anticipating a day like this, when her voice would resurface to challenge what many assumed was set in stone. At the heart of the document are directives about the future direction of the monarchy, a topic rarely touched openly and almost never contested from beyond the grave. What makes this discovery so extraordinary is not only its existence, but the nature of its contents. The will does not simply divide personal possessions or outline private wishes. Instead, it makes demands. It calls for transparency where there has been silence, for accountability where tradition has long ruled, and for power to be shared in ways that challenge the old structures. This is not the voice of someone fading quietly into history. It is the voice of someone determined to shape it long after their passing. And that is why this moment feels less like a simple revelation and more like the beginning of a reckoning. The palace has always guarded its archives with near-religious precision. Only a handful of people are allowed entry, and even fewer are trusted with what is sealed inside. The fact that this will was hidden there raises unsettling questions. Who placed it there? Who knew it existed? And most of all, why was it kept hidden for so long? Early reports suggest that the envelope bore not only the handwritten name, but also signatures of witnesses and a legal seal. Everything about it was official, deliberate, and meant to endure. This was not a letter carelessly tucked away. It was a message designed to outlive every barrier built around it. In the hours after the discovery, whispers quickly reached the upper levels of the palace. Senior figures were alerted, legal advisors were summoned, and by the end of the day, an emergency meeting had been scheduled. Behind closed doors, as the news began to spread internally, the reality began to sink in. A legally valid will, drafted almost 3 decades ago, had just resurfaced with clauses that no one could ignore. Its language is said to be both elegant and firm, leaving little room for reinterpretation. It is a document that does not simply suggest, it demands. Among the most striking elements are clauses that deal directly with the future of symbolic titles, estates, and the way they are passed down. These are matters traditionally decided according to centuries of custom. But the will questions those customs and proposes something different. It is a direct challenge to a structure that has always been carefully protected from such outside influence. Some palace insiders reportedly called it unprecedented. Others called it dangerous. But everyone understood one thing. This was no ordinary document. It was a blueprint for change, written with intention and precision. And yet, perhaps what gives this will its greatest power is not only its contents, but the timing of its revelation. In a period when public trust is increasingly tied to transparency, this document arrives like a thunderclap. It questions what has been kept behind closed doors for too long. It elevates conversations once whispered into open debate, and it forces the palace to confront a reality that was never supposed to surface. Her voice has returned, and it speaks as clearly now as it did when the ink first dried in 1996. The most astonishing part of all is how detailed the instructions are. They are not vague or symbolic. They are specific. They speak of how personal items should be distributed, of who should receive them, and why. They address how certain titles should be re-examined, and they make clear demands for charitable endeavours to be placed outside of direct royal control. In short, they outline a vision where legacy is defined by service, not secrecy. And it is this vision that threatens to unravel long-standing practices that many believed were untouchable. It is still unclear how much of the will's contents will be made public. Official statements have not yet confirmed the full scope of what has been uncovered. But what is certain is that the existence of the will is real. Its words have already reached the highest levels, and behind those walls, decisions are being made that could change everything. The palace can no longer deny it. It can only decide whether to embrace or resist it. But either way, the story has already escaped the shadows. This moment will be remembered not just as the day a piece of paper was found. It will be remembered as the day that paper spoke louder than anyone expected. It carries the weight of unfinished conversations, of promises made in private, and of a woman who believed the truth should one day be heard. The discovery of the will is not an end. It is the beginning of something far larger, and the world is now watching, waiting to see whether its words will be honoured or buried once more.
When news of the will's existence reached the upper ranks of the family, the reaction behind the palace walls was immediate and intense. Long corridors that had echoed with silence were suddenly alive with hurried footsteps, closed-door conversations, and carefully guarded expressions. An emergency meeting was called at Clarence House, the kind of gathering reserved only for moments that threatened to alter the course of everything the institution represents. What began as a quiet archival discovery had now escalated into a full-scale internal crisis, one that no one could contain with polite statements or carefully managed appearances. The legal weight of the document meant that it could not simply be dismissed as a historical curiosity. It was binding, witnessed, and unmistakably intentional. The words on those pages had the power to reshape a legacy. Inside that room, surrounded by legal advisors and senior figures, the tone was solemn. Every person present understood the stakes. The will did not whisper, it commanded. And at its center was a vision of a different future, one that leaned into transparency and accountability in a way that the palace had never truly embraced. One passage reportedly spoke of the need for the royal institution to be more open about its internal workings. It called for the establishment of independent charitable trusts, ones that would operate outside of traditional royal oversight. This was a concept that could fundamentally change how influence and resources are managed within the royal structure. If honoured, it would create new power dynamics, shifting control away from those who had held it unquestioned for generations. The language in the document was not hostile or bitter. It was careful, articulate, and unwavering. It was written by someone who understood the machinery of tradition, but believed that true legacy comes from truth. One line, according to those who reviewed the document, emphasized that real strength comes not from holding on to power, but from sharing it openly. Those words, quietly written nearly 30 years ago, now echo louder than ever. And it is precisely that clarity that makes this situation so volatile. The palace has spent years protecting its image through silence. This document demands the opposite. As lawyers explained the legal implications of the will, the room grew heavier. They confirmed that, despite its age, the document remained legally valid. It bore the necessary signatures and witnesses. It was properly dated, sealed, and stored in a way that made its intent undeniable. It was not a mere personal note. It was a formal legal instrument with enforceable clauses. And if ignored, it could spark legal and constitutional questions far beyond the palace walls. Some advisors argued for suppression, for keeping its details confined to the inner circle. Others recognized that such a move would be nearly impossible now that the existence of the will was no longer a secret. The discovery had already leaked. An insider, either out of conscience or calculation, had passed along fragments to select journalists. The headlines hit within hours. The will that could rewrite the monarchy blazed across screens and newsstands. Diana's final word echoed across broadcasts. Each headline amplified the weight of the document, turning a private crisis into a public reckoning. It was no longer a question of whether the will would shape the future. It was a question of how much control the palace would have over that process. At the heart of the uproar were a few key clauses that struck directly at the foundations of tradition. One of them questioned who should inherit certain symbolic titles and estates, suggesting an approach that departed from the usual automatic line of succession. It was a direct, deliberate challenge to the old ways. This clause alone set off a storm of whispered arguments within the meeting. Some saw it as a betrayal of the past, others as a long-overdue correction. But no one could deny its potency. If made public and honoured, it would set a precedent unlike any before. Then came the clause on transparency. In measured but unmistakable language, the will expressed a desire for greater openness with the public. It called for clear accounting, for charitable endeavours to be shielded from internal influence, and for a structure that placed people, not tradition, at the centre of service. This vision was radical precisely because it was simple. It did not seek to dismantle the monarchy, but to reshape its relationship with the world beyond the palace gates. And in doing so, it struck at the heart of centuries-old habits of silence. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the final section, which spoke of personal possessions. Specific items, including jewellery and letters, were to be handed to unnamed individuals outside the royal household. This was unprecedented. Personal items of that magnitude had always been passed down within the family, locked away behind velvet ropes and guarded vaults. To name outsiders, even without identifying them publicly, was a move that defied everything expected. Who were these people? Why had she chosen them? And what did those possessions symbolize? No one in the room could fully answer those questions. And it was that unknown more than anything that unsettled the family. The legal advisors laid out the choices. The palace could try to challenge the will's enforceability, though such a move would come at a steep public cost. Or it could honor the contents and attempt to guide the narrative, embracing transparency before it was forced upon them. It was a defining crossroads. Some voices were raised, not out of anger, but out of fear of what might follow. Others spoke quietly of responsibility, of honoring words that were meant to be heard. And through it all, the weight of the document sat on the table like a stone, unmoving and undeniable. Beyond the walls of that meeting, the world was already reacting. The leak had sparked debates in the media. Public conversations were unfolding in real time, with millions speculating about what the will contained and what it meant for the future. People spoke of legacy, of promises made long ago, and of a woman whose words carried more influence now than ever. It was as if time itself had folded, bringing the past and present together in a single moment that demanded a choice. This is why the palace's reaction matters so much. It is not just about honoring one document. It is about confronting decades of controlled narrative and deciding whether to let those walls finally crack open. The will is not just paper and ink. It is a voice, quiet yet powerful, that refuses to be silenced. And now that it has been heard, it cannot be unheard. The hours after the emergency meeting were filled with a kind of stillness that is not quiet at all. It was the kind of silence that vibrates beneath the surface, the kind that signals something larger is about to happen. Behind the palace walls, every conversation became sharper, every glance more loaded. The family had gathered, not for a ceremony or a celebration, but for a reckoning. What had been unearthed from the archives was no longer just a document. It was a mirror held up to the monarchy, reflecting both its past and its uncertain future. Those who were there understood that this moment would be remembered for years to come, not because of the will itself, but because of how the institution would choose to respond to it. The next stage of the crisis centered around Charles. Reports from inside the meeting suggest that he was visibly shaken as the full contents of the will were read aloud. His entire life had been built upon tradition, continuity, and carefully maintained structure. Now, a handwritten set of instructions from nearly 3 decades ago had come back to challenge that foundation. He listened as the legal advisors spoke in careful, measured tones, outlining the implications of each clause. They explained how honoring the will would mean opening doors that had long remained closed. It would mean shifting power and visibility in ways that could not easily be reversed. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was real, it was binding, and it was disruptive. The clause that struck the deepest chord was the one questioning inheritance of certain symbolic titles and estates. For generations, these transfers had followed the same quiet, unquestioned path. It was as predictable as the changing of the seasons. But this clause shattered that rhythm. It raised questions of choice, of worthiness, of what legacy truly means. To question inheritance was to question the very structure that held the monarchy together. It was a challenge not spoken through protest, but through ink that had survived time itself. And to Charles it was personal. The words on those pages were not distant or abstract. They came from someone whose memory still lingered in every corner of the public imagination. Those closest to him described a moment when he lowered his head, fingers pressed together, as the advisors laid out the consequences of ignoring the document. It would not just be a legal risk, it would be a public rupture. The headlines had already begun to paint a picture of a monarchy at a crossroads. If the will were dismissed or quietly buried again, it would only feed the growing sense of secrecy and mistrust. But if it were honored, the ripple effect would be enormous. It would signal a new era, one that embraced transparency in a way the institution had never done before. For someone who had spent a lifetime protecting its continuity, this was not an easy choice. Outside the palace, the media storm continued to grow. News anchors dissected every leaked line. Commentators debated the possible implications of the clauses. Crowds gathered outside gates, holding signs, whispering about what this could mean. People spoke of the will with a kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. It was not just a legal document. It was a final message from someone the world had never truly stopped listening to. Her words had power even now, perhaps especially now. They carried the kind of weight that only grows over time, becoming sharper, clearer, and harder to ignore. What makes this moment so volatile is that it touches both the public and the private at once. For the family, this is deeply personal. It reopens old wounds and unsettles carefully maintained balances. For the world outside, it is a story of truth confronting tradition. And in between those two forces stands Charles, facing one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Those who witnessed the meeting say the room felt heavy with history itself, as if the weight of centuries had suddenly grown denser. This was not a situation that could be managed with polished speeches or ceremonial gestures. This was raw. This was real. In that atmosphere of unease, William's presence became quietly significant. Those around him noticed a shift in his demeanor. He had listened carefully, not interrupting as the clauses were read. But the lines about transparency and accountability seemed to settle with particular force. They were words he had heard before, perhaps in his own way, through stories and memories passed down over the years. When the legal team explained that the will's language left little room for reinterpretation, it became clear that silence would not protect the institution this time. A choice had to be made, and it had to be made soon. Charles reportedly struggled with the idea of allowing the will's contents to fully emerge. For him, the monarchy was not simply a family, but a structure that survived by maintaining careful boundaries. Those boundaries were now being pushed open from beyond the grave, and the irony was impossible to ignore. A woman whose voice had been diminished in her lifetime was now speaking with more force than ever before. Her words were no longer just private expressions. They were public demands. Advisors warned of legal battles if the will was contested, but they also warned of something even more dangerous: the loss of trust. If the palace was seen to suppress the will, it would confirm what many had long suspected, that uncomfortable truths were hidden away when inconvenient. But if the palace allowed it to shape events, it would mean giving up a level of control that had defined its identity for generations. It was a no-win scenario, yet doing nothing was no longer an option. The palace's history is filled with carefully managed transitions, each designed to preserve stability. But this was different. This was not a change orchestrated by those inside the walls. It was a change forced upon them by someone who had carefully planted her message decades ago. Her voice had waited patiently, sealed inside an envelope until the right moment. And that moment had come. The people who heard those words in the meeting that day knew something irreversible had just happened. Charles sat at the head of the table, listening as his advisors laid out potential responses, each one heavier than the last. Every path forward carried risk, every silence carried consequence. But one truth was inescapable. The will had spoken and its words could not be unheard. This was the turning point. Whether the monarchy embraced or resisted it, the shape of the future had already begun to change. The seal on that envelope had done more than reveal instructions. It had cracked something open that could never be fully closed again. By the time morning light spilled across the palace courtyard, the situation had already escalated beyond anyone's ability to contain it. What had begun as a quiet discovery in a restricted archive had become a full-scale public storm. Newspapers splashed the leaked excerpts across their front pages. Broadcasts ran with the story for hours at a time. Commentators spoke with urgency, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding. The will had become more than a legal document. It had become a symbol, a lightning rod for questions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Inside the palace, tension tightened like a drawn bowstring, and outside the gates the world watched, waiting for a response that had not yet come. The leak had forced the palace's hand. There was no longer the luxury of quiet deliberation. Decisions that might once have taken weeks now had to be made in hours. In the corridors where control had always been the guiding principle, that control was slipping. Statements were drafted and redrafted. Press officers whispered urgently over phones. Every word mattered now. The wrong tone could deepen the storm. The wrong silence could be interpreted as guilt. And yet, no matter how carefully anyone tried to shape the narrative, the will itself remained the most powerful voice in the room. It was written in plain language. It spoke directly to the idea of transparency, and it left little space for reinterpretation or polite dismissal. The specific clauses at the heart of the uproar were being discussed everywhere. One called for the establishment of charitable trusts independent of royal control. This single line had sent shockwaves through the palace. For decades, charitable endeavors had operated in a delicate balance between public goodwill and internal influence. To remove that influence would mean redefining not just how such organizations functioned, but how the monarchy presented itself to the world. This was not a symbolic request. It was a restructuring, and the world understood its weight. Crowds began to gather outside the palace, holding handmade signs that spoke of truth, legacy, and promises unkept. There was a growing sense that something larger than the institution itself was being demanded. Inside, the debates turned sharp. Advisors, legal experts, and family members found themselves divided. Some argued that embracing the will could be a moment of renewal, a chance to align the institution with modern expectations and restore trust. Others feared it would open doors that could never be closed again, doors that would let the outside world see more than it was ever meant to. The idea of giving away control over charitable endeavors felt to some like an irreversible fracture. It was not just a legal or financial issue. It was about identity. For generations, the monarchy had defined its public image through carefully curated acts of generosity and service. Now that image was being challenged by a voice from the past. But the will did not only speak of charities and structures. It spoke of personal items, too. It named certain possessions that were to be given to unnamed individuals outside of the family. This detail ignited endless speculation. Who were these people? What did these items represent? The palace had no answer to give, and that silence only fueled more curiosity. There were whispers of letters, jewelry, and private keepsakes that might carry their own stories, stories long hidden away. To some, these were just personal belongings. To others, they were potential keys to understanding a truth the world had never fully been allowed to see. With every passing hour, the pressure on Charles grew heavier. He understood that remaining silent would only give the narrative to others. Already, commentators were framing this as a test of whether the monarchy was willing to live by the principles it claimed to uphold. Transparency, service, legacy. Those were the words being repeated again and again on screens and front pages. And yet, to give in to those demands meant stepping into territory that no monarch had ever willingly entered. It meant acknowledging that the future could not be shaped only by tradition, but also by the voice of someone who had written a different vision decades earlier. There was also the matter of the family itself. The will had summoned emotions that had long been tucked away behind duty. Memories, grievances, loyalties, old scars that had never fully healed. William and Harry were both present at the emergency meetings, listening as advisors laid out the stakes. The document did not just challenge institutional structures. It reached into the private heart of their family. Some of the possessions listed in the will held deep emotional meaning. They were more than valuables. They were fragments of a person who had shaped their lives in ways the world could never fully understand. This emotional weight made everything more complex. It was not simply a legal puzzle to solve. It was a personal reckoning. Every line in that will had been written with purpose. Every instruction carried a message. And for those who were closest to her, that message was not abstract. It was personal, and it demanded to be heard. William, in particular, seemed to feel the words more than anyone. His mother had spoken often about truth and legacy, about the power of openness. Those ideals now sat at the center of the storm, and he understood, perhaps more clearly than most, that silence would not protect them this time. Meanwhile, the palace struggled to maintain control of the narrative. Each hour brought a new wave of commentary, new speculation, new pressure. The public was not content to wait. They wanted answers. They wanted to know if the words in that will would be honored. And in a world where information spreads faster than any official statement can keep up with, holding the line was becoming impossible. The palace had always been a place where time moved at its own pace, where tradition created its own rhythm. But now, time was moving at the speed of the outside world, and it was not slowing down. Charles faced a choice that could no longer be delayed. To suppress the will would mean risking a backlash that could permanently damage the monarchy's already fragile relationship with the public. To honor it would mean embracing change that could redefine the institution from within. It was not just a legal decision. It was a question of identity. Would the monarchy remain a structure built on carefully guarded silence, or would it finally allow itself to be shaped by the words of someone who had always believed in speaking the truth? This is why this moment matters. This is why the world is watching so closely. This is not a story about property or paperwork. It is about legacy. It is about whether the institution can survive the weight of a voice that refuses to be forgotten. And as the pressure mounts, the palace must decide whether to step into the future or cling to the past. Either way, the decision will not only define the coming months, it may shape an entire era. The silence that followed was unlike anything the palace had experienced in recent memory. Not a ceremonial silence, not the calm before a public address, but the kind that arrives when everyone realizes history is about to shift. Charles spent much of that day in private consultation with his closest advisors. Every path forward seemed to lead into uncharted territory. The will had done something few moments ever managed to do. It had forced the monarchy to look directly at itself, not as a symbol or a tradition, but as a living, breathing institution standing at a crossroads. Decisions that had once been theoretical were now unavoidable. William was the one who ultimately broke that silence. Those who were present in the room described his voice as steady but charged with emotion. He had listened through days of discussions, watched as advisors dissected the will, as family members debated how to protect what they believed had to endure. But for William, this was not just about the survival of a structure. This was about honoring a promise, a legacy carried in his mother's own handwriting. He reportedly spoke about the weight of her words, about how she had always believed in light being stronger than secrecy. He reminded the room that this document was not written in anger but in hope, and that hope, if honored, could be the bridge between the past and the future. It was not a grand speech, but it was enough to shift the air in the room. He spoke about how ignoring the will would not make it disappear. It would only make its message louder, because the world was already listening. Every delay, every refusal, every carefully worded statement would only fuel the idea that the palace had something to hide. He pointed out that honoring it could do the opposite. It could show strength instead of fear. It could demonstrate that the monarchy was capable of evolution without losing its soul. These were not empty words. They carried the weight of someone who had grown up inside those walls and understood both their beauty and their shadows. Charles listened. Those close to him described a man torn between the world he was raised to protect and the world he now faced. For decades, tradition had been the compass. The will asked him to hold a different kind of compass, one shaped not by silence, but by truth. The legal advisors once again laid out the implications of embracing the will in full. It would require real structural change. It would require handing over control of certain charitable trusts to independent management. It would require acknowledging clauses that questioned old inheritance patterns. It would require addressing the personal distribution of certain possessions. In short, it would mean letting go of control in a way the monarchy had never done before. The palace had weathered crises before, but always on its own terms. This time, those terms were being dictated by a document written decades earlier by someone who had anticipated this moment. That was perhaps the most powerful part of all. She had planned for the future in a way that suggested she knew her words would be needed long after she was gone. And now, those words were at the center of a debate that could alter everything. Even the oldest traditions were no longer safe behind their velvet curtains. William's quiet insistence was not without opposition. Some advisors argued that transparency could expose the institution to further scrutiny. Others warned that honoring the will would set a precedent that future generations might not be able to control. But William countered that the precedent had already been set the moment the envelope was opened. It was no longer about control. It was about choosing whether to resist or to lead. To resist would make the monarchy reactive. To lead would make it responsible for shaping the change rather than being consumed by it. His words did not end the debate, but they changed its shape. As the hours went on, Charles began to understand the gravity of silence. For a monarch, silence can be a powerful shield. It can also be a prison. The world outside was not waiting patiently. The headlines had grown sharper. Commentators spoke openly about whether the monarchy could survive another blow to its credibility. Crowds gathered outside the gates grew larger, their signs more insistent. The phrase most often repeated in those crowds was simple: honor the will. It was not a demand for scandal. It was a demand for truth. The advisors presented him with two final options. One was to challenge the will legally, to claim that its clauses were outdated or unenforceable. This path would be slow, complex, and deeply damaging to public trust. The other was to honor it publicly, to announce a historic shift that embraced its contents. This would mean accepting changes that would reverberate through every level of the institution. It would mean showing the world a monarchy that was not frozen in time, but capable of facing difficult truths. One option protected control, the other protected legacy. In these moments, history often hinges not on grand declarations, but on quiet choices made in private rooms. Charles was not just deciding for himself. He was deciding for everyone who would inherit the institution after him. And though he had spent his life surrounded by tradition, he was also a man who understood the power of perception. The will had forced the palace into the light. The only question now was whether they would step into it willingly or be dragged there by the weight of public expectation. William's words lingered in the air. "If we silence her now," he reportedly said, "we silence the very heart of why people believed in her." It was not just sentiment. It was a clear recognition that this was more than a family matter. It was about trust, about legacy, about proving that truth does not weaken history but strengthens it. Those words settled on Charles like a quiet bell toll, not loud but impossible to ignore. It was the sound of a choice that would echo for generations. And outside, as the palace's heavy stone walls held in their silence, the world waited. It was no longer a question of whether they would respond. It was only a question of how. The will had already spoken. It had already changed the conversation. And now, all eyes were on the man who had to decide whether to meet the weight of history with silence or with courage. In the quiet hours after the revelation, the monarchy found itself standing at the edge of something it had not faced in generations, a complete and undeniable shift. The final part of this extraordinary story unfolded not in a grand hall or during a televised address, but in the tense silence of a world that had just learned that a woman's words, preserved for decades in a sealed will, had outlived the structures built to contain them. The demands revealed in those handwritten pages had reached the public. There was no hiding them now. The world was watching, and more importantly, the weight of a promise whispered decades ago was pressing on the shoulders of those left to uphold it. The decision was made to face it head-on. It was not an easy choice. The corridors of the palace were filled with quiet discussions that lasted deep into the night. Lawyers, advisors, historians, and family members debated over the meaning of each clause, every underlined sentence, every word Diana had chosen so deliberately. Some called for restraint, urging that they will be handled privately, quietly, without spectacle. Others understood that the storm had already broken. Once excerpts had reached the public through leaks and whispers, the story was no longer confined within walls. It was now something alive, pulsing through the press, carried across continents by headlines that framed the moment as nothing short of historic. This was not just a will, people were saying. It was a legacy, a final word, a challenge written not in anger but in clarity. The moment that would define the future came when a single decision was made. Rather than retreat behind centuries-old silence, the monarchy chose to address the matter publicly. Cameras were readied. Flags were lowered in preparation for an announcement unlike any made before. This was not the ceremonial language of royal tradition. This was something raw, something deeply human. The leadership stepped forward, understanding that the eyes of the nation and the eyes of the world were waiting for clarity. A speech was drafted, revised, and read aloud again and again in the dim glow of late-night lights. Each word carried weight. Each sentence balanced between preserving what had been and acknowledging what could no longer be denied. When the announcement finally came, it was measured but firm. It began not with declarations of control, but with an admission. It acknowledged the existence of the will, its authenticity, and most importantly, the significance of its contents. The will had been written in the year 1996, in a moment of great personal reflection. It had been witnessed legally. It had remained sealed for decades, with a single instruction to be opened at the right time. And now, after years of silence, that time had come. The announcement confirmed that the clauses within it carried meaningful implications for the future direction of the monarchy. For the first time in recent memory, the institution itself admitted that change was not just coming, it was already here. The world reacted instantly. Crowds began to gather near the palace gates, not in protest but in a strange, reverent stillness. They came with flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. Some came with their children, others alone, their faces reflecting the same quiet awe that had swept through the world. This was the kind of moment that lived in collective memory, the kind of moment that would be spoken about years from now as the night when everything changed. Journalists worked without rest, broadcasting updates every few minutes, dissecting each line of the statement. Experts debated the legal power of the clauses and whether they would lead to constitutional consequences. But among the noise of analysis, one truth rose above the rest. The monarchy had not denied her words, they had acknowledged them, and that changed everything. One of the most powerful parts of the announcement came when the leadership addressed the nature of legacy. The statement was clear that the will represented not only personal wishes, but a vision of a different future. It spoke of greater transparency, of charitable endeavors being made more independent, of symbolic titles and estates being reconsidered in light of their historical weight. It did not promise immediate structural overhaul. Instead, it promised something far more profound. It promised honesty. It promised a willingness to face the future without erasing the past. For many listening, this was enough to shift something deep inside them. The monarchy, long associated with rigid silence, was suddenly speaking a new language. As the hours passed, discussions turned to what these promises would mean in practice. Charitable trusts mentioned in the will would need to be created or strengthened, overseen not by the royal household, but by independent figures. Personal items long believed to be in storage would be identified and handed over to individuals whose names remained confidential to the public, but were clearly recorded in the document. Titles and properties named in the will would be reviewed with the help of legal experts, ensuring that no clause would be buried beneath bureaucratic tradition. The leadership understood that symbolic gestures alone would not be enough. The words in that will were real, they were specific, and the world expected follow-through. But perhaps the most significant part of this unfolding story was the emotional weight carried by the next generation. William, standing at the center of this storm, embodied a bridge between memory and present. Throughout the entire process, his actions and words became a focal point for millions watching. He did not speak in rehearsed ceremonial tones. He spoke plainly, his voice steady but marked by emotion. He said that legacy could not live in silence. He said that his mother's words had always guided him and that her vision of truth and responsibility would not be ignored. In that moment, it did not feel like an institution speaking. It felt like a son answering a call. That speech would go on to be replayed across every major network. Commentators analyzed the subtext, but for the public the power of it was simple. It was honest. It was human. It acknowledged pain, history, and duty all at once. Crowds grew larger, candlelight vigils began appearing in cities around the world, and social media flooded with messages of support, reflection, and emotion. What began as a sealed envelope tucked away in a hidden archive had now become something unstoppable. It was no longer just about a document. It was about legacy being reborn. Behind the scenes, the work was only beginning. Teams of legal experts, archivists, historians, and family advisors met daily to ensure that the instructions would be respected. Some parts of the process would take years to fully implement. Some clauses would require delicate negotiations and difficult conversations, but the direction was set. There was no going back to the way things were before the will was opened. That moment had already passed. As night turned to dawn, a quiet understanding settled over the palace and the country. This was not just a story about the past. It was a story about the future, shaped by a woman who had written her truth nearly 3 decades earlier. The leadership of the monarchy had chosen not to silence her voice. They had chosen to acknowledge it, and in doing so had opened the door to a new era. For those watching, it was a moment of rare clarity. In a world where institutions often cling to control, this felt different. This felt like a promise kept. And so the story closed not with the sound of finality, but with the feeling of a beginning. The will that had been hidden for so long had emerged from the shadows. Its words had been read, its meaning felt, its consequences set in motion. The monarchy, once defined by silence, had spoken. The echoes of that choice would carry far beyond the palace walls, into the hearts and conversations of millions who would remember this night as the moment when a single act of truth changed everything. This was not the end. It was a turning point, written long ago in ink, sealed in an envelope and finally set free.